Welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we finish with Korea Part 2, from 1894 to 1930. This is going to be a sad episode if you like Korea, Korean pop, Korean people. This is a decline and fall. So what we have is a small country with not a lot of money trying to figure out what to do. They have the time. The West hasn't conquered them yet. There's not even a lot of Westerners even showing up. There's not a lot of desire to conquer Korea from Europeans, from the British or the French or the Americans. There's time, but not a lot of it. And so the idea is things have to go right. And so you've got a couple of questions. Do you Westernize? Do you become Britain on the China Sea? Do you modernize like Japan? You try to take the industry, take the army, but not take the culture. You know, try to be a colossus with 1 foot on each island, 1 foot in the modernization in the West, and 1 foot in the traditions. Or do you stay conservative? Do you do what worked before and trust that China will help you, your big cousin, your ally? And there were attempts at modernization. And in the 1880s, that led to a noble revolt, a conservative revolt. So that was a problem. That was put down with the help of China. But it also meant you couldn't go fast and break things. You would have to obliterate the Korean nobility. And that's easier said than done. And so there's modernization's going to happen, but it's going to be slow. You know? And what happens in 1894 is the beginning of the end. Is the end. It's not even the beginning of the end. It is the end. And that is the Tonghak Peasant Rebellion in 1894. Now, the Tonghak philosophy of Eastern learning had been around since the 1860s. It is a peasant philosophy. It is a folk philosophy. And it is violently anti-Western. It didn't like all these new ideas, especially Christianity, coming in. Now, it's kind of weird that it's especially Christianity, because one of the things it will include in it is a Christian folklore as one of its philosophies. But it was the Westerners are the problem. And so Sheu is this peasant prophet in the 1860s, and he sees this new way, right? We're not going to be Confucian because they're peasants. They're at the bottom of Confucianism. So they do like the idea of Christianity's like, you can rise, right? You can have a better life, that the weak do inherit the earth. You know, there is an attraction to that. They like European philosophy, which is you own your own land. You know, your labor is yours. You should get rich on it. You shouldn't work for the nobility. You should work for yourself. You know, the Adam Smith kind of economic philosophy. And so this is not a lot of enlightenment. These are a bunch of uneducated, mostly illiterate people who are putting things together that they've heard, that they kind of barely understand. They have plenty of traditions, like, hey, this is the way Koreans always acted, and the nobility are not acting that way. And so you get this Eastern learning, the Tonghak. And there's rebellions, but not really rebellions. It's peasant revolts, which always happen. And And the peasant prophet, Sheu, is executed in 1864 for lying to the foolish people, for basically being a charlatan, for leading the people astray. And notice how the government, how Taewangong talks about the people. They're the foolish people. You can't blame them. They're peasants. They're idiots, which is, it's a way of protecting them. They are not responsible for their behavior, but it's also patrician. It's stop talking about politics. That's our job. But what the Tonghak want is to restore Korean pride, to help the peasants, to end Confucian hierarchy, which emphasized loyalty to your nobility and allowed the nobility to exploit the peasantry. So human equality, they like that. Sacred books, reading, right? This emphasis on books, that's a very Christian, Abrahamic religion. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have sacred books. To be fair, so does Buddhism, right? Buddhism has the teachings of Buddha are all written down. So there's an emphasis on sacred books. Confucianism has books too. Baptism, the idea that you could start over again. You start again. Dancing. Well, peasants always love dancing. Every place you go in the world in history, peasants are always drinking and dancing. Rebirth cycles, and cycles to life and to experience, to evolution. Well, that's very Buddhist. But the idea that you don't have to be you don't have to be a peasant for all eternity. And so there's all of these things. Some are Western, some are Christian, some are peasant and dancing. The sacred book's a little bit of everything. The rebirth is Buddhist. There's a lot going on here, right? It's not one philosophy. It's like a potluck, like peasants do. Hey, we're going to have a dinner at the church. Bring something. And everyone brings something, right? And everybody gets to eat. But the goal is to kick out the Westerners, end modernization, and make Korea great again for peasants, not for the nobility. So that would be break up large estates, get rid of debts, right? End debts, or forgive debts for buying land or for debt peonage. You have to work for the nobleman to pay off your debts. That's a servitude. It's not quite slavery, but it ain't far away from it. So, and so that's what it wants. So in 1894, a series of protests erupts into violence against a local governor. See the movie Braveheart. King Gojong is not to blame for this. Neither is Queen Min. Now, they might not have liked all of their policies, but this is one where a local jerk, or insert other names, screws it up for everybody. Because he is so mean to his peasants, they erupted in a peasant revolt. The king sends an army to restore order. Now, he sends like 800 guys. It's not an army. It's basically a police force. It should have been show up, negotiate with peasants. Like, the kings of England do this all the time. Negotiate with peasants. Okay, we'll bring your demands to the king. I'm sure everything will work out. Now go back to your fields. And we'll punish that nobleman for being a jerk, right? Should have been able to work that out. Instead, and I don't know why that doesn't happen, violence erupts and the army is crushed because there's 10,000 peasants and it's 800 dudes with guns. And one of the reasons is those 800 dudes with guns, A lot of them are peasants. They don't like shooting peasants. Take a look at the French Revolution. Take a look at the Russian Revolution. Peasants don't like shooting peasants. So when a government says, you peasants, go shoot those peasants, bad things happen. So Gozheng, the king, calls in China for help, the traditional ally. Help us! And he hangs out in his palace like in a safe house. That turned out to be a mistake, because what he just did was open the door into a bigger problem. The bigger problem was that Japan and China were now competing for leadership in East Asia. We've seen this already, right? Japan in 1876 shows up in Korea. Right? Japan forces Gozheng in 1884 to pay an indemnity. Right? China comes and helps him. Right? So we see these movements on the chessboard. And by inviting China in, which is the very traditional thing to do, it gave Japan an excuse to get involved. This is no longer a domestic thing. And Japan was going to be damned if China was going to take over Korea. Why? Well, Japan was industrializing. Industrializing requires raw materials, mineral wealth especially. Japan has none. Despite being a land of mountains and valleys, it has very little mineral wealth. It's completely dependent on importing mineral wealth. But you know who has a lot of mineral wealth? Manchuria. And do you know where Korea is? Korea is a highway that leads right into Manchuria. You land at the bottom, you go straight up, boom, you go across the river, you're in Manchuria. And so Japan needs Korea, control of Korea, or at least a neutrality of Korea, needs access to Korea in order to access the mineral wealth of Manchuria. Now, what Japan will love to have is a giant railroad, or several railroads that go right from Busan, the southernmost port, right into Manchuria, and then railroads out from a main hub into deeper Manchuria that could then bring all of the coal, all of the iron, all of the copper, bring it to a central hub, bring it down to the coast, ship it over to Japan. But notice what you have to do that. You have to build right through the middle of Korea. And you can imagine the Korean government not so happy with that, with what Japan wants to do to their country. But since Japan needs that, they need the Qin not to be in Korea. Because if the Qin put 30,000 troops in Korea, now they not only have to deal with a fairly weak and poor Korean government, they now have to deal with a fairly weak and poor Korean government plus 30,000 entrenched troops. That makes it harder. And so what Japan does is invade. Basically, before China could take over or protect, seal off Korea, Japan's going to get there first. Well, if you're the Chinese, if you're the Qing emperor, you can't allow that to happen. Korea's been your friend for like 800 years. Gozheng's your like homeboy. The Japanese have been your traditional enemy. Japanese pirates have plundered your cities for 500 years. No. And hey, you're also Qing. You're Manchurian. You don't want a Japanese army advancing into Manchuria. That's your land. That's your iron. That's your silver. That's your coal, not Japan's. And so this sets up the first Sino-Japanese War. Here it is. Everyone throws on. They've been kind of yo, you want to throw a punch? You want to fight? You want to fight me? For like 20 years now. And now it's done. Now they're throwing punches at each other. They circled each other in the ring, and now, in Korea, China and Japan are now at it. Who is going to run East Asia? Now, for 1,000 years, for really more, like 3,000, 4,000 years at this point, it's been China. But in 1894, 1895, it's Japan. Japan had modernized to the point that they could ship troops faster. They had better guns. They had better discipline, better training, better supplies. And they win. They're able also to take over Taiwan and to attack parts of the Chinese mainland. The Japanese Navy rules the sea. And Japan occupies Korea. So now you have a Korean government that is no longer really in charge of its own land. There's a Japanese army. The Japanese are not yet like, we want to run Korea. Remember, they want to build a highway. They want to build a railroad right through Korea to get to Manchuria. Korea doesn't matter so much yet. Korea is the highway to get to what you really need, which is northern Manchuria. So the Japanese are okay with the Korean government staying in charge, as long as they don't mess around, as long as they don't cause any problems. Gojang, actually, they're useful, right? If they tell the Koreans, hey, whoa, it's cool. The Japanese are cool. Don't worry about it. That could settle problems. Like, if Japan runs the show, they're going to tick off a lot of Koreans. But if they're like, hey, we're just building a railroad, man. You got problems, you go to the Korean king. Westerners do this all the time. All the time. In colonies all over the world. All the time. You know. That's what the English did in India. You don't actually want to run India. This is how it works from 1700 to 1856. You don't actually want to run India. That's expensive. That's hard. You just want the money that you can get out of it. So let the local leader deal with all the social problems. Let him take the blame. As long as the Korean government doesn't mess around. Now, here's the problem. Queen Min did not become queen, get rid of the Taiwan Gong, make an alliance with China in order to become a puppet of Japan. And so she starts looking for help. She starts looking for help. Can China come back? Can China come back? And as they're kind of looking at that, China is just falling apart into the what will become the Boxer Rebellion. The Sino-Japanese War, the defeat in the Sino-Japanese War, just was like the last straw for all the traditionalists in China. They're just done with the Qing dynasty. All right, what about the USA? Problem with the USA is the USA has a better relationship with Japan. The USA wants to trade with Korea. Yes. But do you really want to tick off the Japanese? No, they have a better relationship with the Japanese. What about Russia? Russia wants Manchuria too. Right? The Russians are just to the north. Maybe the Russians. The problem is the main Russian army is 6,000 miles away in Europe. That's a problem. And so, but it's a flirtation. Well, this is one of those things that is kind of crazy that happens. And what it is an assassination of the Queen of Korea. There's an incident, and and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, and I'm sorry if I do. The Yulmi incident. And this is where the Japanese ambassador, and there is no doubt, there is no historical conflict about this. The Japanese ambassador, maybe with orders from Tokyo, maybe on his own, leads a palace coup to assassinate Queen Min. He hires a bunch of assassins. They break into the palace. They kill the guards. They kidnap the king and beat the ever-living poop out of him, right? But they can't kill him. Remember, you can't kill the king. That will make the Korean people revolt. That would be bad. But, they humiliate him. They beat him up, right? But Queen Min, they do terrible things to. And there's debate about what they do to her. But it seems to be she's definitely murdered, she's possibly raped, and her body is burned. Why does this matter? Because this is the foreboding of what's going to happen to Korean women under Japanese occupation. Korean women, especially, are going to be traumatized under the Japanese occupation. Now, famously, there's the Korean women of World War II, what's called the comfort ladies, the prostitutes. I can't say prostitutes. That sounds like they get paid. No, these are sex slaves. But it's a foreboding. What they do to Queen Min is going to be what they do to lots of Korean women. There is basically no Korean great-grandmother who was not traumatized by the Japanese. None. Whether it was before, in this period in the early 1900s, or by the Second World War, Japan takes over Korea as a colony. Basically, if you have a Korean grandmother, very likely her mother. If your grandmother, it depends on what age you are. If your grandmother wasn't traumatized by the Japanese, her mother almost certainly was. One way or the other. So Japan takes over Korea as a colony. So what happens to Korea? Now remember, it was an ally of China. It wasn't a colony of China. It's a colony of Japan. And what happens is the Japanese treat them the way Westerners treat other peoples that they colonize. Living standards collapse. Within 10 years, the living standards in Korea collapse. Korea is exploited for its slave labor. Remember building that railroad? Well, it would be expensive to build that railroad if you had to use Japanese labor or Western labor. You had to hire people. But you can make the Koreans build it. You could take them off their farms. You can take them out of their factories. And you can make them build it. And if they don't want to do it, you shoot them. You could put them in mines up in the mountains for mineral wealth. So Korea is going to be exploited for slave labor. Hey, you need more people working in your factories back in Japan because you need 3 shifts. You need a midnight shift. Bring in Korean slave labor. Why have Japanese women be prostitutes? Bring in Korean women as sex slaves. Because it's kind of embarrassing if your own women make so little money they have to be prostitutes. Right? Much better if they're moms and married. Right? So Korean women, on the other hand, they can be exploited. All industrialization in Korea now is going to be directed towards Japanese looting. Because to make Japanese industry richer. There's going to be basically nothing left for Koreans to use. It's all being dedicated towards Japan. Now, that this is the story of what happens in Indonesia. This is the story of what's happening in Africa and in Latin America. The entire economic system of these countries is being directed not to local trade, but to European trade. And in this case, to Japanese trade. The Japanese are just doing what the Europeans are doing. They're just closer to it. The British to the Irish. You know, instead of being 3,000 miles away, it's 100 miles away. Practically neighbors. This, of course, leads to revolts. I mean, of course it has to lead to revolts. Right? The people revolted against their own king. They're going to revolt against the Japanese. That leads to violent reprisals. The Japanese come in and shoot everybody, which leads to more revolts, which doesn't go anywhere because there's no outside help. China is collapsing into civil war again, and then the breakup of the Republic, and then another civil war. The British make alliances with Japan because now Japan is powerful. And Japan's going to win their war against Russia. The one group that could have come and saved Korea is defeated in 1905 by the Japanese. So the Japanese have staked a claim. And everybody else is like, yeah, okay, you're too far away to mess with. You're 6, 7, 8,000 miles away. 10,000 miles away, fine. You want to exploit Korea? Fine. And so there's no outside help. The only people who really could help is China or Russia. Russia gets defeated, and China is so internally breaking apart that it can't do anything to help Korea. In this time period, Japan will take Manchuria too. After 1905, we'll conquer Manchuria, and we'll achieve that goal of building that highway. And that really just ends any chance. Japan cannot let Korea go, no matter how much they protest. On March 1st, 1919, there is a self-determination protest. Again, the USA shows up again, using Wilson's self-determination policy from the 14 points. The idea was to end World War I with the 14 points. And the most important of those 14 points, everyone remembers the UN, the League of Nations, but the most important, the one everybody heard, including Europeans, was self-determination. Now, part of that was for the people of Europe, the Czechs, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Baltic peoples, the Balkan peoples. It was to break up these large empires in Central and Eastern Europe. But if you're African, Indian, Middle Eastern, East Asian, you heard that and said, oh, he's talking to me. Now, it turned out Woodrow Wilson wasn't talking to them, and we'll see how that plays out like in Vietnam. But they thought, hey, here's the language of freedom. Here's the Declaration of Independence. Here's the USA again leading the world. And so they had a giant protest which said, give us what Wilson wants. Woodrow Wilson, help us. We want what you're promising. 20,000 people would be killed in the reprisals, in the put down. The idea was if you protested, you got murdered by the Japanese. And what the Japanese start to do is then genocide. After this, you more or less get a policy of cultural genocide. If not literal genocide of murdering the people, it is the cultural the extermination of the Korean culture. Korean names are outlawed in 1932. The Korean language is outlawed. The idea would be it would die out and be absorbed into Japanese. It was the idea of making Koreans into enslaved Japanese. It was a cultural genocide. It's a clear policy, and there's no debate about it. By 1930, only 5% of Koreans had a post-elementary school education. So even if Korea got its independence, it wouldn't be able to run it. It wouldn't be able to own it. Korea was poor, was destitute, and it had no middle class, no merchant class, no intellectual class that could run the show. In fact, this is how Europeans, again, ran many of their colonies. They promised one day you'll get independence, and then they never invested in the things that the country would need to run itself and have independence, which just justified the Europeans saying, well, you're not ready for independence yet. Well, yeah, but you don't have a university. You don't have teachers. You don't have schools. You never built them. And so again, we're talking a cultural extermination. The one thing that happens, and this is the lone place this happens in other than the Philippines, but they're completely separate, is the spread of Christianity. The place in East Asia that Christianity finds its most success is in Korea. Again, the exception is the Philippines, which was colonized by the Spanish. It's just different. And why? Because Christianity was not Japanese. The Japanese do not like Christianity. They don't embrace it. There is no real Christianity in Japan. Even today, there's no real Japanese Christianity movement in any large numbers. Like, do people exist that are Christian and Japanese? Yes. But as a governmental policy, as a cultural policy, no. And it's Western. It allows a connection to Europeans and all the other stuff, the freedom, the democracy. But it's also, Christianity is a poor person's religion. You may forget that, but Jesus was a poor person. He was itinerant. Well, he starts as the son of a working class carpenter, but then he's itinerant for 3 years. Him and his homeboys walk around the deserts of Galilee for 3 years. They have no money. The Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, is blessed are the weak. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor. Why? Christianity was born in a time when the only rich people were Romans or Hebrews who worked with Romans in Judea, in where Jesus lived. So Jesus' message was to poor people. Well, that works in Korea because they're poor people. They're oppressed. The Romans, when you say the Romans, you can change that to the Japanese and be perfectly fine with that. The stories work the same. And so Christianity is being patient. Christianity is not revolutionary. It doesn't say overthrow Rome. It says be patient. Salvation is on the way. And your next life will be better. You will get salvation in the next life. If you don't get it in this life. But hang on, it's on its way. And let's be honest. Knowing how this class is going to end, they were right. Because Korea today, if all of you who are using a Samsung phone know this, is way better off now than it was in 1910. It is richer, is more educated. Those of you who watch BTS or listen to any of the Korean pop music know it is way better to be a Korean person now in 2020 than it was to be a Korean person in 1910. It was salvation. It wasn't easy. It's going to be terrible. It traumatized entire generations of people, some of which have now passed on, and a generation of which is dying from old age. So if you are Korean, you should ask. You should ask the old people in your family, what were the Japanese like? Because those stories are going away. But Christianity was a good religion. Because unlike Confucianism, which is listen to your betters, listen to your orders, Christianity is one day you'll be free. One day. One day you will get salvation. So, and that day would come in August of 1945, when American army showed up. All right, so that's going to be the end of Korea. It is a sad episode. It is a tough episode to do. Talk to you later. Be safe. Stay healthy. Take care. See you soon.